Today's video is brought to you by my amazing patrons on Patreon. Priority deck requests and extended discussions are just some of the many perks you get for being a patron. Consider supporting the channel today. Welcome back to today's build. Whether you're just looking for upgrades or have no idea how to build this deck, I'll be your guide to this wonderful game we all love. Let's get started. Today's deck is as wild as magic gets. Her name is Neera, and these are Bubblebutt Bombshells. Because I'm challenging so much of traditional Neera builds today, I want to take some extra time elaborating on why I'm making the changes that I am. Today's patron requested that this deck not be limited to any budget. So while you'll definitely see some pricier cards today, this still isn't meant to compete at CEDH tables, just high power casual. And in order to make that viable, there are some big changes we'll have to make to the traditional Neera philosophy, which can broadly be described as Spellslinger. One reason players build it this way is because instants are cards you could play on another player's turn to get more Neera triggers on each round of the table. These instants also play well with cast triggers, such as the kind that copy spells, since you can resolve cast triggers before wild magic bottoms the spell. The problem I have with this is that mana does not grow on trees. Well, at least not in these colors. And 6 mana Neera does nothing to protect herself from the 1 and 2 mana removal spells that are so abundant in this format. And the cards these colors would usually use for protection don't play nicely with Neera's wild magic ability. If 6 mana is also board wipe season in game time, then there are going to be a lot of games where you don't get to use her ability at all, or maybe only get to use it once. For all these reasons and more, it doesn't seem like we can really rely on having Neera in play. And so much of the average list on EDH Rec is filled with do-nothing cards that only really work with Neera in play, and that is not tenable. We need to be able to take advantage of Neera's ability without relying so heavily on it for the deck to function. Now, to get Neera to see play at all, because her mana value is so high, we need a lot of ramp to reliably cast her, which in these colors almost exclusively comes from artifacts. And since Neera's ability gets the most value when we have a lot of cards in the deck with high mana values, that ramp can also help us hard cast those big mana spells if something does go wrong with the Neera plan. And since we already know we're playing several artifacts, we should keep an eye out for payoffs that will synergize with them. But the kinds of big spells we're most looking for are ways to reset the board and leave us with some advantage, or else put us in a strong position to win that turn or the next. Wasting slots on payoffs that don't do either just draws attention to your board and can make you a target with nothing to show for it. But we can't just play big mana spells, or else we won't be playing anything in the early turns, so we also want to have alternate methods of playing our cards. And alternate casting costs do double duty here, by letting us pay a small amount of mana to trigger Neera to hopefully flip over a larger spell. Even with those considerations though, we'll be a little slow to get going. We'll want to include some control elements in the deck to buy time to get to our top end, as well as secure the win once we finally get set up. The best kinds of board wipes that we can run to do this are our damage-based board wipes, since Neera also has 7 toughness and can survive most of them. But we should try to be very selective about any counterspells, since Neera's ability doesn't really like to play with those. Now, with all that said, let's discuss some other things you should be thinking about during this deck. Because Neera triggers when you cast the spell, any cast triggers like Cascade, or the kind commonly found on Eldrazi, will still resolve, even if she puts those spells on the bottom afterwards. Eldrazi could also be great ideas for the big mana payoffs we want in the deck to capitalize on Neera's ability. And since we're also playing a lot of artifacts to ramp into our top end, if we do end up playing some Eldrazi, it could be smart to keep an eye out for any lines to connect colorless permanents together. It's also true that Neera's ability Resolving helps boost our storm count, even though one of the spells gets sent to the bottom of the deck. So permanents with cast triggers, or that track how many spells we've cast each turn, might also be in play. Lastly, among the alternate casting costs we might care about, you should also know that MDFCs can be cast on either side when resolving Neera's ability. So if there were a card with a cheap front that we wanted and an expensive back that we wanted, we could cast either. Before we start cutting, I want to show you why I'm making some of these changes using this scorecard. Because we can't rely on getting several Neera triggers, we need to be happy with casting these spells before or without her in play. And with her on the field, it's also important to think about how happy you are resolving a spell because of Neera's trigger, instead of Neera's trigger, and casting to fuel Neera's trigger. To see why these cards are being cut, just ask yourself, after all the work you've done to get Neera in play, wouldn't it be disappointing to flip one of these off the top? And at all other times, resolving these cannot help set up your top deck very well, because their draws offset the information you got from scrying. When you resolve Opt, you do not know what's on top anymore. Preordain leaves you with, at most, the information of the top card, but only from among the top 2 cards. Which means the only things these cards are really good for is a cheap spell to pitch to Neera. We're trying to take advantage of that ability without relying so hard on it for the deck to work well, and these cards just suck for that. Playing bad cards to trade in for good cards in a deck where you can't always rely on being able to make that trade just means you're playing bad cards. Make these swaps, please. It's easiest to understand why Niv Mizzet is here with all the other conventional Spellslinger tech in the average Neera list, but it doesn't do what we want our payoffs to do. Remember, we're looking for things that reset the board leaving us in the lead, or else threaten a win within the next turn, and none of these do that. Niv has combo potential, but the way Wild Magic works is really awkward at juggling combos, so I don't think this really works here. Instead, consider these payoffs. But especially Ugin, since he can reset the board, leaving our artifacts intact and an additional removal engine if he sticks around. So what do our lands look like? Being a 2-color deck, we can afford to run a lot of basics, but there are a handful of utility lands we can also take advantage of, starting with Mystic Sanctuary and Halimar Depths. Both of these are meant for the later game, and one even sets the top card of your library, which is so much better than merely seeing the top. Although much weaker, we're of course running the Scry and Surveil lands as well, and some bounce lands to complement our Mana Rock package and ensure we can keep hitting our land drops. We're lastly playing Temple of the False God and Spine Rock Null to help make up for some of the other tap lands in the list. So what's our timeline? The first element to our game plan is ramp, and lots of it, at varying rates and on various turns. I'm also including a laser screwdriver in this list for several reasons, but really its every mode is useful to us. Whether it's as ramp, top deck information, a goad that we can use to control the board, or tapping down a certain winter orb, which we're already primed to take advantage of due to our reliance on artifact ramp and our need for control elements to slow the game down to buy time to set up Neera. By this point, we can probably hardcast a lot of the payoffs in the deck if we happen to draw one that's needed right away, so that we don't rely too much on our commander. But Otherwise, we can deploy her to start churning through the deck into some powerful haymakers. We have payoffs that reset the board with us in the lead, payoffs that shut down opponents, and even payoffs that could prompt concessions immediately if you're lucky. Some of which we can even guarantee with Conduit of Ruin's cast trigger, or by responding to wild magic with Mystical Tutor. And yes, we are still playing cheap instants to trigger wild magic on enemy turns, but really only the most impactful ones that we'd be happier with in other situations too. That said, the real star of the show is Displacer Kitten. With Neera in play, cast any non-creature spell, such as a mana rock that we no longer need, and stack the triggers so that Kitten resolves before wild magic, blinking Neera. When Neera re-enters, she has no memory of her previous trigger, so when you resolve the wild magic trigger and cast a non-creature, which is really likely based on this deck list, you can repeat this process as many times as you like until you either hit a creature or a non-creature you actually want to resolve. And because most of our creatures are payoffs, hitting a creature is still likely an acceptable outcome. One thing I want to point out here is that this Neera build is not focused on specifically instants and sorceries, but non-creature spells as a group. Some of our best pieces in the deck will track these cards, and it's less reliant on our commander to retain an explosive presence at the table. The interaction we're packing isn't anything close to the competitive level, especially since we're not protecting Neera as much as we are planning for the eventuality of her demise, but it's more than interactive enough to keep you in the game by wiping boards and shutting down enemy game plans. Between that and how explosive Neera is when she does go off, even though she won't be winning in the front half of the game, she'll definitely leave your opponents wishing they'd attacked you more when they had the chance.
A very special thanks to all my amazing patrons. When I started this channel, I wanted to talk about deck building decisions with my videos, but in practice what ends up happening is that I talk for 30 minutes about all the nuance of a deck, which is longer than I'm comfortable with posting to YouTube. Here, patrons can request priority deck techs, access extended discussions on their favorite decks, in-depth guides on complex game actions, and more.
So if you enjoy this content, consider becoming a patron today. One of the things my patrons have made possible is a special series of deck techs that I'm really excited to show off to you guys. When I finally get them all uploaded, I'll be giving away a special collection of altars and tokens that I've made, corresponding to each deck on the channel. For example, for the Merkle Lord of Bones deck, the prize is a set of double-faced altars of the most prominent cards in the deck, whose backsides are set in the constellation frame with updated text to show that they're acting as enchantments now. For every 1,000 views on each video, I'll increase the prize pool for that deck. All you have to do to be eligible to win is be subscribed to the channel.
Consider supporting the channel today. If you like this video, here are some of the decks I'm working on next, so if you like what you see, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any, and check out the playlist in the top left for more. Thanks for watching!